Hi, friends. I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. In this season, we're talking about my book, White Picket Fences, and today's episode takes a look at the themes of Chapter 11, which is called Possibilities. My guest today is Nicole Fulgham. Nicole has been a champion of education reform for many years now, and she approaches the problems of inequity in education here in America as a Black Christian woman with personal experiences and an understanding of policy, and those aspects of who she is all combine to offer so much insight into what is needed in our schools today. I love the way Nicole underlines the importance of expectations when it comes to our kids and our schools, and the importance of community engagement, and the importance of believing in our children, and the importance of policy change. And it's this insistence on all of these things and the ways that we can be involved in making our schools better for all kids that make me really excited for you to meet her today. All right. Well, my guest today is Nicole Fulgham, founder and president of the Expectations Project, which I'm going to have her tell you all about. But first, I just want to say, Nicole, welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you inviting me. Look forward to the conversation.
Well, me too. I have followed your work for a long time, many, many years, but I am sure that there are listeners who don't know who you are, what you do, and who will be interested, especially at this moment, I think, having some information as well as guidance and how to think about and participate in education, public education in the United States will be really helpful. So I'd love to just start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to found the Expectations Project and what it is.
Sure. Happy to. So I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, in the city, in what I would probably call a working class neighborhood. So we had a few lower middle class families, working class folks, and definitely a fair amount of people who lived in poverty. And so I saw education inequality kind of outside my front door every day growing up. My parents were a working class family, but were able to really work hard and sacrifice a lot of things to send my brother and I to schools outside of our neighborhood, starting from preschool. My mother majored in early childhood education in college, so she definitely knew what she was looking for us. And wrestled with whether or not to send us to our neighborhood public schools, and ultimately decided to send us to an urban Lutheran school, which were schools that, as neighborhoods like Detroit became increasingly African American, a lot of private schools fled and these schools stayed. And so they were like a kind of the next step up from the neighborhood public schools in terms of, honestly, quality. So they were good, but they weren't, sort of this like super like Tony,
right,
expensive private suburban school, but it was arguably safer. And there was something a bit more that we got, which was a huge sacrifice for my parents to do that. And I am forever grateful, but sad that they had to make that choice. Right. Anyway, so by the time I got to high school, I got accepted into an exam public high school in Detroit called Renaissance High School. And I saw the difference between what I was getting from my friends on my block in K through 8, but I definitely saw the difference in high school. I had been prepared both by my school, but also my parents to be able to get into this very competitive public high school in Detroit. And from day one, they were talking to us about, SAT prep and, taking AP classes. They assumed we were all going to college because we were, quote unquote, best of the best of Black kids in Detroit. And as a result, 99% of us went on to college, and we're all still friends on Facebook because I'm old today, and people are attorneys and physicians and running engineering firms, and sort of this amazing success rate of mostly Black kids from Detroit, all of whom definitely not wealthy. But the difference is all of my friends who didn't get into that high school, which was most of the kids on my block, went to neighborhood school, which had no AP classes at the time. No one talked to my friends about college the entire time they were in high school. And so about half of them dropped out. My brother and I are 2 of 3 kids in our neighborhood that we know of that went on to a 4-year college. And the crazy thing is that they were just as smart as I was. I am convinced. Smart, witty, curious, had unlimited potential, potential, but we were going to two very different school systems within Detroit Public Schools. So that really changed kind of the way I looked at the world early on. The other piece of information, this is a lot of background about how I got here, but I think it's important to hear people's stories. And so indulge me, if you will.
Absolutely. That's what I wanted.
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, I was attending a church with my family. It's an AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, which has a rich tradition in activism and sort of engaging in civil rights issues, since its founding, splitting off from the Methodist Church that wouldn't allow, then I guess we were, right after slavery, wouldn't allow Black people to sit in the same pews as the other Methodists who were white. And so this church began. And so growing up, I saw this very large, influential church repeatedly hold elected officials accountable to the things they said they were going to do when they kind of came through the congregation to shake hands and, wink, wink, we'd like your vote kind of thing. The pastor was like, absolutely. Yeah, come on through. And they would have them back in 6 months in front of the entire congregation asking them. And so you said you were going to do these 3 things. You haven't done them yet. When are you going to do them? And they consistently called out the leadership in the city, Black, white, purple, it didn't matter. They were like, you said you were going to do it and you didn't do it. Wow. So we're going to now start a protest, or we're going to call your office. We're going to bring you back in front of this church that you promised these things to. And for me, I see that as an extension of my faith. My faith pushes me, because it was always on the issues of justice and equity and serving those who had the least. So those 2 experiences, the school inequality and growing up in a church that really put that in practice, really led me to the path that I'm on today after, being a public school teacher for a few years, getting my PhD in education policy, because I was trying to figure out how do you change the system to make it for thousands of kids. And over the years, I just wanted to really marry these 2 ideas of what would it look like to have people of faith, incredibly focused from their faith lens, and I'm a Christian, from a biblical lens, focused on, of course, we have a system that is right now educating different groups of kids based on race and class to different outcomes. And as people of faith, that shouldn't be, because we assume all kids have potential. What would it look like to mobilize that group of faith-motivated folks and to have them push their elected officials kind of en masse, right, to change the policies, the systems, the practices, and to demand that they fix this system year after year after year, so it more equally reflects the potential of all of God's kids. That's what I do with the Expectations Project.
Thank you so much for giving us that story. I want to add one more piece to it, or ask you to speak to one more piece to it, which is your own experiences teaching in Compton, I believe, right out of college. Is that right, with Teach for America?
I did, yes. I joined Teach for America right out of college, and definitely learned a lot. I think my students, I'm not sure who taught who more, but it's the way with first-year teachers. And I taught for a few years and taught 5th grade. And, that was definitely one of those life-changing moments, because it made me really put into practice all the things I said I believed, right? I said, well, growing up in Detroit, I know my friends are just as smart as I am. Why aren't we pushing them in the same way I'm getting pushed, right? I believe as a Christian, God doesn't differentiate academic potential between Black and brown or white and Asian or rich and poor kids. Imago Dei, right? For us all. But then when you're on the side of the classroom to have to actually prove that to be the case, it changes your perspective. It didn't take away my firm belief in that. I just had to figure out, how do we collectively get there? And, it was really hard. I was very fortunate to be placed at a school that had some veteran teachers who were, at that time, the age of my parents, or quite frankly, my grandparents, and they took me under their wing, and they were willing to let me kind of shadow them in the classroom, learn from them, pick their brain, cry with them. A lot of them were Christians. They prayed with me, right, outside of the classroom in a legal way. But it's this amazing community that they taught me how to engage and get to know my students' families. And so my families became partners in their kids' education. And I just was kind of naive enough to think actually, we should be able to do this. And so we were able to be really honest with kids and families about where they were academically. And in fact, it's 2/3 of my kids were reading at, probably a second grade level or below in fifth grade. Some were functionally illiterate, and same with math, really below grade level. And so I was honest with them, with their families, not in a blaming way, but just we've got work to do. And so people got on board. I got lots of volunteers from my church at the time, community members to help us do extra tutoring because my kids needed more time to catch up. But it really was this amazing thing. I'm glossing over, lots of like tears, prayers, mistakes, failures. But at the end of the year, my fifth graders on the standardized test had the most academic growth of any fifth grade class in Compton, which for a brand new teacher is sort of crazy. And I don't say that to say like, oh my gosh, I was like an amazing teacher, because I probably wasn't, right? I was just sort of like naive enough to like try a bunch of things. And I had the energy of, I don't know, a gerbil, right? So I was like, I can work like 80 hours a week, things that in reality are just not sustainable to be a teacher that way for 30 years. It's not. So I don't judge other teachers who aren't doing those things. But it was this beautiful thing to see so many of my students and their families see, oh my gosh, I had students say, I didn't think I was smart until this year. And that is like what our role is supposed to be. And so for me, it's like, well, then how do we, it's part of why I left the classroom was, okay, that's one classroom. How do we fix a system, right, that can allow more of that to happen, to support teachers differently, to support schools and families differently, so we can unleash that God-given potential in every kid.
Yeah, I so resonate with that. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is because I've been walking through during this podcast season my book, White Picket Fences, and the chapter that we're kind of on is called Possibilities. And it's a chapter that I wrote about our daughter Penny and the possibilities that opened up for her as a child with a disability within the school system. And I've just been so struck as I've watched her. Earlier this week, we had a PPT meeting for her, and you've got this team of people, and I'm just so aware of how much they believe in her. They believe in her abilities, and they certainly are going to make accommodations based on her needs, and they're going to give her the support that she needs, but they really do believe in her. And in watching that and in watching the difference, honestly, she's had teachers before where in a dance class, for example, she's had the same class, but different teachers. And one teacher will write me and say, Penny got tired after 20 minutes and she couldn't continue the class. And then I'll talk to the other teacher who's teaching the same lesson on another day. And she'll say, no, Penny has never gotten tired. And it really came down to, you believe she can do it. And so I reread your book in preparing for this interview today, which I'll just mention here for people who are interested, called Educating All God's Children. And I was struck by that same thing of just like what you just said about the student who's like, I never believed I was smart. Like, I never knew that. And you believed that, right? You actually believed what you had said theoretically must be true about your neighborhood. It's like, okay, I'm going to actually live that out. And so I wanted to ask you just to talk a little bit as I think about not just the, kids with disabilities, but other kids who are on the margins for other reasons and who are vulnerable, especially when it comes to education for other reasons. What do you think are like societal expectations are for those kids? And how do we begin to change the expectations, right? I'm thinking of the Expectations Project and why you've even called it that.
Definitely. That's exactly the reason, because for me, it was such a differentiator at that school, high school that I attended. Honestly, like, I think if we dug deep down and sort of honestly in like the depths of our soul, and I say we as a society, when we're to ask ourselves, do we truly think that every child can achieve, right? And when I say every, I mean every, like the child whose parents are incarcerated, the child who's homeless, the child who, just immigrated here and, is 6 years old and has to learn English first, right? The child whose, family is really struggling economically, who doesn't have, the clean clothes that we, sort of think that every child should have, whatever the thing is. I don't think we do. And it's hard to acknowledge that as a country, because it's this wonderful, like, sort of bumper sticker slogan, right? Like, all kids can achieve, like, everyone has potential. And that's great. But like, we need to do the deep soul searching and say, like, it's okay to kind of acknowledge, like, I'm not sure that I believe that, right? And it's not
Mm-hmm.
surprising that we don't, because we see so many messages reinforcing that, right? Like, we
Yeah.
don't see messages reinforcing these, superstar stories of kids with every, like, seeming, you know, every possible disadvantage succeeding. They'll seem like almost one in a million, right? And for good reason. Like, it's harder, right? Like, I don't think, I mean, I'm very clear that, the child that I'm raising, is going to have different advantages even than I did, right?
Yeah.
as a youngster. And so, like, there's an expectation people probably have of her, race aside. She's African American, as am I. But there's some assumptions, right, that she'll be able to achieve. But I'm just not sure that we deep down believe that about everybody. And the reason I'd say that is because if we did, we would be investing in kids differently in our country. Like, we just would. Like, we
Yeah, I
wouldn't.
totally agree. I'm thinking of I remember it was when Penny was really little that I read the line, the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Exactly. Which
And
is like a punch in the gut, right?
yeah.
Like, it resonates. And that's the thing. Like, I wrestled with that as a teacher. And I came in with, like, absolutely. But when you get in the thick of it, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, like, I know. And I had students who had some, they experienced trauma, some of my students, during the school year, with family things that happened. And you're like, wow, okay, so that just happened. And I'm asking you to focus on fractions on Monday morning. And I know it happened in your house over the weekend.
Right.
It's not that I still had to help them focus on fractions, right? Because that was long term what they needed.
Mm-hmm.
But I also can, do that and make sure that the family has the social services or counseling support they need, through the school or through the county, right? Like, both things can be true. But what we often do is, and not just because we're biased or like it's our own bigotry or prejudices, it's out of, like, sympathy that we can sort of fall into this, like, oh my gosh, but I couldn't expect them to do that because they're
Mm-hmm.
growing so much. And it's like, get them the help they may need, but also, like, they still need to learn fractions, because, like, that matters too. And, like, who are we to say that they don't get the right to learn it? But again, like, at the end of the day, if we truly believed that every kid would succeed, you wouldn't see, you go into schools now, suburban and urban schools, and just the facilities, everything is so dramatically different. You wouldn't see that type of inequality if we truly believed every kid can achieve. You just wouldn't.
Yeah. And again, my like little, petri dish has been my own household as far as watching the same be true when it comes to our daughter, because there, again, can be low expectations and high expectations. And she's got, similar to what you described in terms of your kids, like a ton of social support from her family and community that plenty of kids don't have. But there is still that sense of, if our attitude towards her is that we believe in her, certainly in terms of her potential to learn, but also her potential to contribute. Because I think that's part of it too, is like, what if we assume that she is someone who is going to give to our society? And we don't know exactly how, but what if we assumed that about every kid, all the kids that you described as well, who I think we often assume are going to just take from our society, which is absolutely not true and does not honor the image of God in them whatsoever.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I wanted to ask you about, you have written about like a history of how Christians have been involved in educational, initiatives and reform in the past. So I'd love for you, if you can, just to sketch a little bit of what the history is, but then also talk about the contemporary moment. Are churches, are Christians involved in public education reform, and why or why not? So past and present, could you just speak to that a bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so many of the public schools, or the beginning of schools in America, were largely Protestants, Protestant communities that were founding them. There was a deep belief that, educating young people, particularly a lot of these Protestant communities reached out to immigrants, right? That
Yeah.
was an important part of their calling. Now, granted, they were doing it because they wanted to make sure people knew Jesus, right? Like, that was a main thrust of it. Like, oftentimes the educational texts were, religious documents. So
Mm-hmm.
we can discuss that at some other point. But there was also a belief that people needed to be literate and contributing members of society, which that part I definitely, adhere to that. Over time, that lessened, right, as schools became, like, truly public. And then there was the massive debate over prayer in schools, et cetera. the place where I would say like the conservative Christian, conservative Christians really fell down on this promise was when schools were being desegregated in the 60s. And that is this really, really disturbing moment for a lot of more conservative white denominations that started all of these, quote unquote, Christian academies. And I say quote unquote because like the root was pretty wicked why many of them were started. I'm sure they talked about Jesus, but the root was pretty foul, starting these all white Christian academies to ensure that their white children didn't have to go to school with Black and brown kids. And so that is, one of those parts of our history that we don't like to talk about as much, but it's part of our story. It also leads to why we've had, in some communities, resistance when churches now, right, want to get involved. This is changing a bit, I would say, but there are communities that remember that history and so are more skeptical, right, of Christians wanting to get involved. I also think, as I wrote in the book, there in some communities, Christians are known more for getting involved in public schools to push sort of religious issues and to be sort of countercultural, whether it's protesting the removal of prayer in schools or questions about curriculum dealing with sexuality issues or whatnot. And my take is if that's your cause, like by all means, like champion your cause. I think the sad part is that we are often known more for that in connection to schools than being a partner that wants to come in and say, oh my gosh, kids are struggling, like families are struggling. How do we support this school? I would say the good news is like that tide has turned, I would say, in a lot of communities in the last 10 or 15 years. So we do see so many more congregations that are taking on trying to develop really honest, symbiotic partnerships with public schools and just coming in and saying, hey, we want to be helpful. What do you need? Which is always the best way to partner in any context, from my experience, which has been exciting. So I think where we are still growing is that last step of how do we sort of over time eliminate, as I like to say, eliminate the need for every church to need to tutor kids to get them ready for kindergarten because there's no preschool in our community that's affordable for families, to saying like, actually, if we would organize, advocate, and speak truth to power to get the affordable quality preschool for everybody, like long-term, that's going to impact thousands of kids instead of the 20 kids we're tutoring, right? Thousands of kids will then have what they need to be ready for kindergarten. We can maybe still tutor too to like make it even better, but it's the systemic, like change the system, the policies, the practices, the funding mechanisms. That's the place where I think we are on the cutting edge and can step more into that space. And the last thing I'll say is when Christians en masse, and I say this with broad strokes, caveat, there are plenty of Christian denominations that have been doing this work for years. They typically are denominations of color, particularly Black communities engaged in education policy, from the civil rights movement on. So I want to make sure I acknowledge that history. But from a broad strokes contemporary space, I think a lot of us have been involved in policies around vouchers for private schools for obvious reasons, right? Lots of us send our kids to private or Christian schools or have them in our churches. And so that's a self-interest we have. And also, potentially a belief that parents should be able to be free to choose with government tax dollars where they send their children. So, but lots of opportunity for us to engage in the policy reform. And I think we shouldn't let those opportunities go by when the system is so broken and so not reflective of the kingdom of God for all of his kids.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions based on what you just said. And one is just that I feel like, especially in Christian circles, there's a tension that comes up between this idea of like individual responsibility and structural concerns. So are schools failing and our kids falling behind because of systemic racism and structural inequality? Or are they failing and schools failing, kids falling behind because individuals aren't doing what they should be doing? And I hear this debate come up in different language and in different ways, but and I tend to think it's a false dichotomy, but I'd still love to hear just what you have to say to Christians about the relationship between individual responsibility and this more structural or systemic problem that we see in various ways, but especially in schools.
That's a great question. And it is like a constant ongoing discussion, in part because there are truths on both sides, right? And I like, and this I'm sure is frustrating for some people when they talk to me about these issues, I tend to see the gray in between, usually because things are not as stark as we want to kind of put people in a bucket. You believe this or that. And it's like, well, if only we were that simple, right?
Right. Yeah.
So on this one, I think there's space and movement needed on both sides. I think when I look at what is going to move the needle more for a larger number of people, I look at it from a systems perspective, right? Again, that analogy I gave with we can tutor kids for the next 100 years, like tutor 20 kids to get them ready for kindergarten,
Right.
or try to get quality preschool for an entire state that didn't have it. They had no funding for poor families previously. And then it's like, 100,000 kids now get it. And it doesn't make the policy perfect, right? All sorts of implementation challenges. We all know that, right? But it's a root. It's getting at the root is where I like to come at things from personally. So are there places where individual families may need more support? Of course, like, we're both parents. Like, we know that there's always, it feels like, more we can do to support our own in this work. But I also recognize putting all of that responsibility on individual families, and it's usually parents, right, that get blamed. I hear this a lot. Well, if the parents cared more about education, or the kids cared more, X, Y, and Z happening. And it's like, well, so let's try to put ourselves in the position of a family who is struggling to make ends meet. Whether it's a single 2-parent family, grandmama, auntie, whomever, if they're working, 2 or 3 jobs, right, don't have paid time off to go up to school to like meet with the teacher at 2:00 in the afternoon, right, which is a privilege that a lot of families don't have. Like, let's start linking all of these systems together outside of school that are impacting an individual family's options and choices, right? And how is that impacting not how much they care, but what they're able to do and put into practice that fully reflects how much they actually do care. Because I've never met a parent who's like, I could care less if my kid graduates from high school. Like, I haven't met that person.
Yeah.
So that's why for me, like, yes, we always want to support individuals, but we also have to look at not just the educational system that's impacting them and the institutional racism, all of those things, but also the other systems outside of school that are impacting their ability to kind of execute on all of the beliefs that they have about why education matters so much. I think we see that now in the time of COVID, like loud and clear, right? The fact that we all of a sudden had to start doing virtual learning, and there were parents who did not have high-speed internet and didn't have like laptops for their kids. Like, millions of parents don't have that, right?
Yeah.
And now kids are going back to school if they can. Parents who have to, whose kids' schools aren't opening because of, spikes in COVID, and they have to stay home and do learning. If the child is 7 and is on Zoom calls, but mom and dad drive a bus, a city bus, and they have to go out to drive that bus to get the paycheck to pay the rent, like, tell me how that's going to work, right? So it's like that. Those are the types of dots that I hope people can continue to connect in our churches to realize, like, oh, there's the system thing that actually matters too.
Yeah, I've actually, one of the things that has gotten me particularly engaged in education these days has been recognizing last March that my kids were able to go immediately onto Zoom for a couple of different reasons. One, they had been issued Chromebooks by their school, so they were already familiar, as were their teachers. 2, we had multiple rooms in our home where we could spread out and each be on different devices. And it wasn't perfect. It's like, oh, we have an old laptop and sometimes Zoom crashes or somebody's on a phone. But nevertheless, they were able to do it. And I was so aware that tens of thousands of kids just in my home state of Connecticut were not able to keep learning. And it was like, well, whose fault is that? Like, it's certainly not the children's fault. Yes, I feel like this moment has just really like been like a magnifying glass or a spotlight on the inequities that were already present, but has certainly drawn my attention even more to it. That said, one thing I wanted to ask you about, so I think we're talking before this episode will actually air, and it's the day before the final presidential debate. So I've watched the first debate.
Gumdrops, yeah.
yeah, can't wait. And the VP debate. But what I noticed in the 2 debates that have already happened and the one that's happening tomorrow, I looked up the topics. like education is not mentioned. I think Kamala Harris like made a reference to the fact that there were kids who were not learning, but it was like a passing comment. And again, I looked at the list of topics for tomorrow's debate, and education's not on the docket. So especially in this moment, I'm just curious, do you have an opinion on like why our national leaders are not talking about education and reforming education and like actually helping to change the system?
Yeah. It is tragic, right? Because I feel like we went through this moment right before schools were in the school year was supposed to begin, when like that was like, the topic du jour, right? Everyone from, the president of the United States on down, had opinions on, what schools should be doing and to open up or not. And so we had this like little window where I was like, oh my gosh, it's actually coming front and center. But it was really only like a political sort of discussion, right? And kind of like political point scoring for a national dialogue. So I think we're back to this place now where people are just kind of hunkering down, and, it's just incredibly complicated. And my theory is that no one actually knows what to really do about it, right? So that dilemma I gave, a few moments ago about the little child who has to go to school virtually, whose parents have to leave the house to work. Like,
Right.
I've asked that question in so many spaces of like policymakers, think tanks. I'm like, so has anyone figured out what that kid's gonna do all day? I wouldn't want my 7-year-old at home Zooming by herself, right? Like
Right.
that's unsafe, like depressing, a whole host of things, right? And it's one of these things where like no one sort of knows. And I almost feel like right now, everyone recognizes that it is such a spiraling downward like challenge that has multiple layers, that I almost feel like people have kind of given up in the public sphere, even talking about it, because I feel like we're almost or have almost given up on this idea that we can get it right this year. In this moment, and that we know we're all very clear that certain groups of kids are going to come out fine, parents who have the ability to, pay for private tutors or a pandemic pod or whatever, right? And no judgment on that, right? Like people are going to do what they're going to do for their kids. It's just that we know that the gaps are going to be wider. And I just have a sneaking suspicion that no one wants to talk about it for that reason. And oh, by the way, it's always like the left behind topic that no one wants to talk about in any presidential election here. And sadly, like this is another one. And it's, we're just short-sighted, honestly, as a nation. Like we want to talk about the topic du jour and not realize like if we don't fix this particular problem, like we're losing like generations of kids in our country, like stature and ability to be effective as a nation. It's literally like, as one of my friends says, it's like a national security issue, right? If we don't like think about it globally, like if we don't fix this and have a completely like massive, uneducated population of young people in this country, like we're going to have major problems. But again, we'd have to have the longitudinal view to really take that on. And we just historically haven't as a country.
Yeah, I think that's all true, where it's always been left behind. And then we've got the current moment where it's like, I really don't want to talk about that because it's just a hard and bad situation right now. I want to back up a little bit and ask you just to describe what the Expectations Project actually does. I realized I didn't ask you to elaborate on how your organization functions and what you're doing to really be a game-changing force in this whole equation.
Yeah, so we are the nation's largest network of faith-motivated education equity advocates, which is fun to be able to say after laboring over this beloved organization since 2012.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So our work is to educate, equip, and then mobilize faith constituents, so people of faith around the country, to take tangible actions to hold elected officials accountable, to push them for policy change on the issues that matter most for equity for all kids. That sounds like a mouthful, but it really, when you boil it down, it is, right now we have a network of about 50,000 individual people of faith who are doing all sorts of things that are advocacy actions. So emailing members of Congress or the state house or their school board on something they want to see changed, making phone calls, letter writing campaigns, petition signing, doing public comment, used to be in person at school board meetings. Now it's virtually, on pieces of legislation and issues. And so that's sort of the action piece, right? And so those things might seem minuscule, but they actually add up into real change. Like any elected official, if they get, especially at the local level, 100 people calling them about an issue, they're like, oh, shoot, I guess I should pay attention to that.
Right.
And so we identify places where there are relevant issues or policies coming up that have the potential to be game changers. So we did a whole campaign in Indiana a few years ago on getting state funding for low-income families to have preschool, an issue I've mentioned a couple of times already, and there wasn't any. And so we believed, and other organizations did as well, that if we can rally people to keep speaking about this, and obviously our folks are talking about it from their faith and values perspective as well, that if we get the attention of the people that have to make the decisions and, for lack of a better word, pester them enough and really help them see our perspective, that laws and practices will change. And that did in Indiana. They passed the first ever piece of state legislation to allow low-income families to access funding for preschool. And so it changed the game for tens of thousands of families, right? We're doing that on school discipline issues when we see, Black kids are 4 times as likely to get suspended from schools nationwide. And so we're digging into why is that the case, and how do we flip that to have more restorative justice practices, which align very much to our beliefs as Christians. And so we are, having our advocates are taking action, phone calls, emails, petitions, et cetera, to really shift the conversation around that. So when policies come up for a vote, whether it's, eliminating the practice of suspending kindergartners and preschoolers, which is amazing to me that actually happens, right. But and putting in place funding and teacher training for restorative justice, which is helping kids still have consequences, but in a loving, let's restore the relationships and get to the root of why this child is misbehaving. That's very different than simply suspending them. And so that's the work that we do. It involves a lot of educating people on issues. So we do lots of trainings, and now they're all, webinars, of course.
Right.
We create small group Bible studies on various topics, prayer guides for congregations to use sermon talking points for pastors, right, to get the education out there. And then we have these tangible ways that our constituents can get involved to really change what's happening in their local community. And, just this past, since I guess the last 4 or 5 months when COVID, we shifted a lot of our work to that piece. We've had our constituents have taken over 64,000 individual actions in the last few months on a variety of education issues. And they've seen, they've gotten the attention of their elected officials in just the way that we'd hope they would. It's very exciting. We have lots of power and voice. Let's use it.
And so if someone wants to get involved, would that be as an individual, as a church community? What would that look like if someone's listening to this and wants to know either broadly, I just want to get involved in changing education in America, what can I do? Or specifically, I want to get involved in the Expectations Project. What would that look like?
Absolutely. So if you want to get involved with the Expectations Project, go to our website, expectations.org, and sign up for our email list. We don't spam you, I promise. We're a small organization. You're not going to get 5,000 emails a week from us. But we will then get you connected to ways that you can take action in your local community. We make it as easy for you as possible because we know everyone's busy. But you can find a way to attend a webinar if you want to, or read more about a policy and then take some very specific, fairly easy to do actions locally. So we encourage that as one step. We also have resources for congregations that want to learn more. I think I referenced, small group Bible studies, which will be virtual now, I'm sure, for many congregations, ways for congregations to kind of self-assess how equity is happening in their local communities, and then come to a conclusion on, one of 3 issues. Which one do they want to do more to educate their own congregation about? We're also happy to be a resource to talk that through. We do lots of, quick phone calls and consultancies with congregations who are like, we want to do this. We're not sure what to do next. So that's part of what we do as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I will make sure that just that information gets into the show notes so that people can follow up, because I've certainly found, as I have become more engaged, even just in the past 6 months, in issues around educational justice here in Connecticut, that really my knowledge was much broader than it was deep. So I knew a lot about kind of education in America. And it's well, what about education in your town, in your county, in, the local places where you actually could make a difference, and certainly your congregation could make a difference. Because as much as I bemoan, like I really wish that our national leaders were talking about and making reforms when it comes to education, at the same time, it's on the local level in terms of town by town and state by state where a lot of that change and transformation really can happen. So thank you for being a leader in that.
No, that's exactly right. And I know like the national politics, takes up a lot of oxygen, it has for the last, several years. But you're exactly right. So even if things are happening at the national level, that our constituents are, sometimes frustrated about, depending on the issue, we always try to pivot, pull back. So that actually doesn't preclude us from looking at what's happening in our state, our city, our district, because it's honestly easier to move the needle because you're like a bigger fish in a smaller pond, right? Like 100 people calling their state representative on an issue actually will get their attention, because they don't often get that type of attention. If 100 people try to email the Secretary of Education or their senator in Congress, a lot harder to get their attention. You're going to need like 1,000 people, right? Or 10,000, right? To get their attention. So like local politics matter, or I should say, not even politics, local policies and decision makers matter.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you are doing. It's really exciting to hear about how that has grown, and obviously to even get a sense of the thousands and tens of thousands of people who really do care about these issues. And I hope that just having had this conversation, there'll be a few more who get on board. Yeah, really grateful for all the work you do and for your time today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having this conversation. I look forward to keeping the conversation going. And anyone who has, questions or wants to connect to us, please feel free to do so. We're definitely want to be a resource for all who are interested.
All right. Will you tell us your website one more time?
Yes, it's expectations.org.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Nicole. And I look forward to talking to you again sometime.
All right. Take care.
Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. I do want to let you know about what's coming. We have a couple of really fantastic upcoming episodes, and I'm sure you don't want to miss them. I certainly don't. I'm going to be talking with Andy Crouch next week about love and power and vulnerability. It's going to come out. It's going to be released on Election Day, even though we will record that conversation beforehand. And I think it will be a helpful guide to what promises to be an intense day for our nation. So please join me for that. And then the following week, I'll be talking with David Bailey. Some of you may remember him from the first episode of this season. And we will be talking about what faithful love, justice, and reconciliation work looks like. And by then, we'll know something about this election. And we will be talking about what love and justice and reconciliation work looks like, no matter what is happening in the political sphere. I tell you this for two reasons: to give you a sense of where we're headed, but also as a prompt. If you have not subscribed to this podcast, please do. Please share it with friends. Please rate it, review it. All of that will help more people become aware of what's going on here, because these are conversations for people who care about nuanced arguments, who care about compassion, who care about working together across dividing lines. And if you are a listener already, then I suspect you know more people who care about these things and who would benefit from these conversations, as I certainly do week after week. Thanks so much again for listening and for being here. And I do, as you go into your day today, hope and pray that you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.